Hi, everybody. Got a big audience here today. Nice to see a good turnout for Laura. She is a really esteemed speaker. Really happy to have her here as part of our Emotional Wellbeing Network speaker series. So Dr. Laura Kubzansky is professor of social and behavioral sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She's published extensively on the role of psychological and social factors in health. Other research projects and interests include biological mechanisms linking emotion, social relationships, and health, relationships between early childhood environments, resilience, and healthy aging, the role of emotional well-being in individual and societal health, and how psychosocial stress or assets may interact with toxic environmental exposures to influence health. She's a fellow in a number of professional associations, has served as an expert advisor to numerous panels at foundations and health agencies, and is a principal investigator or co-investigator on a wide range of grants. She has really been a pioneer, I think, in bridging psychology, which is her background discipline, and public health and epidemiology. And so if you look at her research, like on Scholar Google, you're like, wow, how did somebody manage to do so much? So we're really excited to have you here, Laura. So thank you for speaking, and I will turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you. It's great to be here. I think I just need to share my slides. See if that works. I don't know if I have to wait for, okay, let's see. So let's see, I try sharing. Doesn't want to share. Oh, wait, here we go. I think that worked. And let me just do
There you go.
this and switch the settings. Okay. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Crystal. And it's great to be here, and always fun to have the chance to share my work with an audience who have interest in this area. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing, looking at the relationship between mental and physical health in the realm of healthy aging. And some of the ideas I'm talking about today, that social and psychological factors, and particularly emotion-related experiences, can influence health, are definitely not new. I sort of wish I could take credit for it, but these ideas have been around for a really long time. From the time of the Bible, you can find references to this, to Aristotle and Hippocrates. Although, interestingly, it has been controversial, actually, as well. So today I'm going to talk about why I think this work is necessary. I'm going to define some key terms, review some of the evidence we have for these associations, and then talk about the implications of this work for building a healthier population. So I'm going to get started. So COVID notwithstanding, people worldwide are living a lot longer, and the pace of population aging is increasing dramatically around the world. So by 2050, the world's population age 60 and over will total 2 billion, and that's up from 900 million in 2015. So these are really big numbers that we're thinking about. And the shift in population aging started in high-income countries, but are now catching up in low and middle-income countries, where those are the greatest demographic shifts. So of course, longer life is great. It can mean more opportunities for both individuals and for societies, but that opportunity really depends a lot on health. So if the years of life that are added are dominated by declines in physical and cognitive function, then the burden of aging for both individuals and society is high. So really the goal is to increase health span, which is the period of life that we spend in good health, free of chronic diseases and disabilities of aging. And if the goal is to increase health span, then the question is, what are the factors that are going to contribute to health span? What enables people to live longer but healthier? Now, most of the work, particularly in public health, that looks at longevity has really focused on risk factors and deficits and how they can reduce health span. So trying to take away things that make people less healthy, which is really important, of course. We tend to focus on problems. But there's also the question of whether there are resources or what we have called assets that might make it more likely that people can age in better health. And, not that we should never look at deficits anymore, but that it may also be useful to spend some time looking at the assets as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And really what, the goal here is to shift the distribution of health span, right? So what are the factors in the population that we can either, reduce or add in order to shift the distribution of health span so that more people in the population live healthy for longer. Okay, so one of the factors that we know matters for health are psychological factors. And we also know there's bidirectionality in these relationships, right? So physical health impacts psychological function, but psychological function also impacts physical health. And for today, I'm mostly going to focus on directionality in the direction, between psychological functioning as it affects physical health. So most studies up until relatively recently have taken what we call a deficit approach. So they've examined the effects of poor psychological functioning on physical health. So these are things like stress and distress, so depression, loneliness, social isolation, anger. And those studies have really looked at what are the effects on physical health down the road. But in the last, 5 to 10 years, there's been an increasing effort to look at what we've called assets. So one asset being positive psychological well-being. So what are the health effects of positive functioning mentally? So one of the key issues here is what's the definition of positive psychological well-being? And we'll talk a little bit about that. The big question in the field in terms of whether positive psychological well-being actually matters for health is whether there are any benefits that are independent of the effects of poor functioning. So for a long time, people were like, things like emotional vitality or joy or positive affect only look like they matter for health because they tell you that someone's not depressed. But really, it's that depression harms health. And so the positive psychological factor is just a signal that someone's not depressed. And in that case, it's not terribly interesting to look at it in its own right. So part of the goal of this work has been to say, well, look, if positive psychological well-being matters for health, does it have independent effects beyond simply telling you that someone is not depressed? And then, of course, there's a question of if you do see these associations, then, are they, what are the mechanisms underlying them? Then there's another set of questions that are related, which is beyond psychological well-being, are there other psychosocial assets that would function similarly? And if so, what are they? And then another important piece of the puzzle is sort of how these factors operate in the larger social context. And what I have here is to say that's mostly a topic for a different talk because I have limited time, but I'm happy to talk about that if people have questions at the end. But just to say that it matters a lot, the social context and the background environment in which these associations are playing out. All right, so I'm going to start with the work that's been done on psychological factors in health. And I always like to share this with an audience, and often when I'm talking to an audience with a lot of psychology people in it, they're always surprised to hear this. So the idea that stress and emotions influence health, has been well accepted in the lay population, has been treated with a lot of skepticism in biomedicine. This is where, not being in person is not as much fun because usually I get to see the kind of look of surprise on people's faces. But as you'll see from this quote here, which is taken from the American Heart Association website, stress is not a confirmed risk factor for either high blood pressure or heart disease and has not been proven to cause heart disease. And you can find this on the American Heart Association website, the British Heart Association website, Australian Heart Association website. So this is not unique to the US approach. And basically they say, well, stress, we don't like stress. We don't think it's great for people. but we don't really endorse it as a risk factor. And the assumption is if there's any effects, it's because, you know, people who are stressed may engage in less healthy behaviors, and it's behaviors that actually drive heart disease. And, you know, this is problematic in the sense if it really is a risk factor and we don't dedicate any resources or allocate organizational or community orientation to what to do about it, then it's a lost opportunity. Now, if people are skeptical that stress and distress are risk factors for poor health, they're even more skeptical that positive factors could be health protective. So this is a paper that came out in the Lancet, which is a pretty high-profile journal, where someone, you know, purported to really test the hypothesis: does happiness affect mortality? With the question of, do happier people live longer? And they did this in a UK data set of a million women, although the actual study didn't actually have a million women. And what the study concluded was that it was reverse causality, that really there's no association between happiness and mortality in the direction that people posited. That was just kind of a myth. And what you'll see here in middle-aged women, poor health can cause unhappiness. After allowing for this association and adjusting for potential confounders, happiness and related measures of well-being do not appear to have any direct effect on mortality. So this is actually a hypothesis that lots of people really don't believe. Now, I thought this paper had any number of methodological problems. We wrote a letter to the editor, it was published, you know, about some of the problems with the paper and why they might not have seen an effect. But it's emblematic of a lot of the thinking in the field in biomedicine. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know and where the evidence sits for both of these ideas. So in terms of how psychological functioning would play a role in physical health, it plays a number of different roles, and not all the evidence is going to be relevant for all of the different ways it could matter. You know, the first thing I have here is that it could play a role in the etiology of disease. So in as a causal factor contributing to whether someone gets sick or stays healthy. This, I have the stars here because this is probably the most controversial hypothesis. This is where people have the most concerns and arguments about whether or not this is true. It could also play a role in triggering health states or in exacerbating symptoms. So for instance, you know, someone who experiences a high level of anxiety might trigger an asthma flare or an autoimmune flare or something like that. It could also be involved in the progression of disease. So getting a serious diagnosis can be very upsetting, and that can make it harder to comply with the medical regimen, which then means that you may not progress, you know, sort of recover as quickly or hold off secondary events as well. And then managing the disease, which is related, can also be difficult when people are highly distressed. So there's evidence actually for all of these pathways and processes, but today I'm going to mostly focus on this most controversial of ideas, which is the first one, which is where I've spent a lot of my actual research time. So much of the work here has really focused on taking a deficit-based approach, so looking at things like anxiety and depression in relation to health and illness. Although more recently, we and others have been looking also at what we've called assets, so positive psychological functioning that might be health protective. So I should say that the strongest work in this area has actually been done in relation to cardiovascular disease, which is it is the leading cause of death and morbidity and pretty much worldwide. So it makes sense that people are interested in it. There's a lot of reasons why that's where a lot of the work has been done. There have been definitely studies in other health outcomes, and I'll touch on some of those today, but you'll see a lot of work that's been done with cardiovascular disease as a result of you know, where the data are. In the next slides, what I want to do, though, is show you what some of this work looks like with using the most rigorous epidemiologic methods that are available for doing this kind of work. So, of course, the ideal study would randomize people to be, you know, let's say we're looking at anxiety, to be anxious or not anxious for whatever, 30 years, and then see who ends up having a heart attack. so that you would know that anxiety was really a causal contributor to the disease endpoint. But of course, that's not ethical or feasible, which means that, we have to use other methods to try to ascertain whether these associations are, working the way we think they are. So the most rigorous epidemiologic methods basically use observational data. They try to assess the psychological factor when people are known to be healthy, so that you're less worried that the physical health is driving the report of the psychological function. And then we evaluate who goes on to develop disease or stays in good health over a long follow-up period, while accounting for a whole range of known other risk factors to kind of rule out that those are really driving the effects. And probably the most important thing that people worry about is what the initial health status is, so that when I measure psychological functioning, I'm not worried that that really is just being driven by their physical health status at that assessment period. Because bad health could lead people to tell you that they're depressed or anxious. And then the other important methodological tool is to try to have objective measures of health outcomes, so you're not relying on self-report, because again, psychological states can influence how people report out on their health. So I'm going to show you just one study that we did, because it's sort of using these methods, and this is how many of the studies in the field have gone. So this will just give you a sense of how it works. So this is a study we were doing on whether loneliness would lead to increased risk of developing coronary heart disease. So we used data from the first National Health and Nutrition Exam Survey and their follow-up studies. This is a nationally representative study across the US. The primary measures that we were using was loneliness. It was a single item measure from the CESD scale, which is not ideal, but it turns out that these findings have been replicated in lots of different studies, so that's reassuring. We had coronary heart disease that was ascertained using ICD-9 codes on hospital nursing home discharge reports or death certificates. So that's what we call an objective measure of the health outcome, where we're not relying on someone to tell us if they had a heart attack. So we're, more confident that there's not, any confounding between self-report. And health status is assessed repeatedly over a long follow-up period to assess when and who goes on to develop heart disease. And we assess a whole range of covariates, including, sex, race, marital status, socioeconomic status. We assess health behaviors and health conditions. We also assess depressive symptoms, because people weren't sure if loneliness was really that different from depression, and social networks. And I want to say, all of these studies always measure health behaviors and include them as if they are confounders. So things like smoking or alcohol consumption, physical activity. In truth, one of the pathways that we think happens, one of the ways in which psychological factors influence health is through these behaviors. So if you're adjusting for them, essentially you're kind of over adjusting, because you're taking account of the pathway. Always seems a little bit less than ideal, but none of the biomedical journals are interested in publishing this work if you don't adjust for the health behaviors, because they want to see if there's any effect over and above what happens there. So we always adjust for them. It's also true that health behaviors could confound the association. It's possible that, physical, activity, for instance, also drives psychological factors. So it's tricky to work with it. But almost all of the studies, and certainly anyone I'm going to talk about today, will have adjusted for a pretty broad range of health behaviors. So this is just what the study looks like. They do an interview and a physical exam at the very baseline, which was between 1971 and 75. Developed disease over what period of time? And what you can see is that in the dark black line, the people who had the highest levels of loneliness developed disease earlier than the people who were lower in loneliness. The finding was stronger in women, just to say. But what we found was higher loneliness was associated with about a 76% increased risk of developing heart disease over the period of the follow-up. And this held after we adjusted for a whole range of covariates, including depression and social networks. So that's a pretty typical study in this area. We've done work like this, looking at all different forms of distress. On the next slide, I'm just going to show you another form of distress. This is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is particularly interesting because it's one of the more severe forms of distress that develops in response to trauma. And here we had a sample of about 54,000 women who had done a screening assessment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the other thing that's kind of interesting when you look at PTSD, if you have pretty good measures, you can kind of distinguish between whether the trauma itself is driving greater risk or the symptoms and the distress that develops after trauma. And so in this case, we found the latter, which is that women who went on to have 4 or more PTSD symptoms, which were considered clinically relevant levels of post-traumatic stress, had about a 60% increased risk of developing heart disease in the 20 years of follow-up from the time the PTSD onset. And that was also, this study, because it's in this very large cohort study, we were able to adjust for an enormous range of covariates, including demographics, health conditions, lots of behaviors, and this also adjusts for depression because people are often concerned that maybe depression is really the driving factor. So the findings are pretty, and there have now been lots of replications of these kinds of findings over time, suggesting that, not just in any one sample, but in lots of different and more diverse samples. This is a study that we did looking at distress and COVID-19 related health outcomes. So, more recently looking at, we had 3 longitudinal cohorts, mostly of women, but one of them had men as well, with about 55,000 people overall. When COVID hit, we started sending out, like everyone else, we started sending out, surveys to see how people were doing. We were running the surveys on a monthly basis initially, and then moved to a quarterly basis and did regular follow-ups over the 1-year period. And we measured a whole set of forms of, different types of distress. And what we found were that folks who had higher levels of depression, anxiety, worry about COVID, loneliness, and perceived stress prior to infection, prior to developing a COVID infection, were at greater risk of developing long COVID and having more impairments due to long COVID and COVID-19 hospitalization. So again, very similar findings to what I've been showing, only with a different outcome. And then the other interesting thing that we were curious to know, if people who were kind of distressed in multiple ways, right? So they had both depression and anxiety, which often are comorbid, or different kinds of distress, were they worse off? And it looks like, sort of more is worse. So they were at a higher risk of long COVID. And the next slide just kind of shows that, highlights that a little bit. So what you can see, this is for folks who had probable depression. They had about a 20% increased risk of this long COVID. If you had 2 or more types of distress, the elevated risk went up to about 50% increased risk. And just to compare that with known risk factors, so this is the risk of smoking, which is at about a 10% increased risk of having long COVID, and the risk of having long COVID associated with hypertension was just under 20%. So these psychosocial factors, have meaningful effects relative to, risk factors that are more well accepted in the literature. All right, so I promised that I would talk a little bit about not just, the dark side, but what happens if we think about positive factors and assets. And, for a long time, we sort of thought being, joyful wasn't really good for your health. But the question is, if you experience and nourish joy or, positive psychological functioning, will you do better on health? And as I mentioned earlier, the big question here that people have, if they, even are willing to adhere to the idea that stress and distress matter for health, is, is being positive anything more than just the absence of negative? So to think about this, we started out with, all right, well, first we have to understand what is positive psychological well-being. And we want to, be clear that the absence of negative psychological factors is not the same as the presence of positive, right? So these things occur on a continuum. And it's important to understand that, what you're measuring. Now, in the data, while even though we know these things are on a continuum and that not being depressed isn't necessarily the same as being joyful, what we usually have in our data just measures, up to depressed, not depressed. It's actually much harder to find studies that measure the true sort of other end of the spectrum of positive functioning. Now, it has been measured in a variety of different ways, so you can find some studies that have done it, and because it hasn't had a systematic an orientation on this work, it's a little more scattered. So, it's worth just kind of mentioning that a number of people have looked at various facets of positive psychological well-being. The concepts that have been considered are things like optimism. That's where we've done a lot of our work, looking at life satisfaction, life purpose. Of course, Crystal's here, who's done lots of work in this area, positive emotions, happiness. And then most recently, I'm expecting there are folks here who've been involved in the Emotional Wellbeing Network. And of course, we tried really hard to sort of bring this all together into a single definition that could be used going forward. So that definition, which is still a working definition, but is here, emotional well-being is a multidimensional composite that encompasses how positive an individual feels generally and about life overall. It includes experiential features and reflective features about life satisfaction, sense of meaning, ability to pursue goals that can include and extend beyond the self. And these features occur in the context of culture, life circumstances, resources, and life course. Now, there's not really any work to date that has used this definition to look at health in relation to health outcomes, but there's plenty of work that has features of this definition that were used to look at in relation to different health outcomes. And I'll show you just a few of those studies here. So this is some work, as I said, we've been doing a lot of work looking at optimism as one facet of emotional well-being that we think is very relevant for physical health down the road. And this is some work we did using data from the normative aging study. It's about 1,300 men who've been followed over a long period of time. For this particular study, we had 10 years of follow-up. And we had a measure of optimism that we were able to use, and we looked at whether optimism protected against risk of developing coronary heart disease. And here, what I'm showing you is that the findings were quite strong, almost surprisingly strong. This was the very first study we did in this domain, and we were surprised at how strong the finding was. So they were, just about half as likely to develop heart disease over the follow-up period, and we adjusted for all the known coronary risk factors, including, hypertension and cholesterol, as well as behaviors. And we adjusted for, negative emotions, again, to this concern that we're not just looking at the absence of depression here, that we're finding effects above and beyond that. Now, the finding, what's really terrific is this finding has been replicated in many different studies, many different samples, not just by our group. So it seems to be a quite robust and solid finding. We've gone on to look at whether it's related to other health outcomes. So this is some work we did looking at optimism and healthy aging in 2 different cohorts. So here we took the hypothesis that higher optimism would be associated with a greater likelihood of aging in good health. So in the samples that we were using to look at this, we looked at people who were, age range 66 to 68, which is where you start to see health deteriorate usually. We defined healthy aging as being free of chronic diseases, having any subjective memory impairments, or having any major physical limitations. So that was the definition of were they healthy agers. We did this in 2 different cohorts. One was using data from the Nurses' Health Study, where we had about 33,000 women who met our eligibility criteria for the study. We had 8 years of follow-up, and they had no chronic disease at the time that we assessed optimism. And then we also did this in the Health and Retirement Study, which is a nationally representative study of older men and women, has about 5,600 men and women in the data set. So this study had men too. There were 6 to 8 years of follow-up. And these folks were healthy agers at baseline, meaning they met our criteria for healthy aging at baseline. So we were pretty confident that health was less likely to be driving the reports of optimism. We had the same measure of optimism in both cohorts, and we looked at whether people who are more optimistic were more likely to be healthy agers, and that is in fact what we found. I'm showing the findings from both cohorts here, so you can see that in the Nurses' Health Study, folks in the highest quartile of optimism had a 23% greater likelihood of being healthy agers, and folks in HRS in the highest quartile had a 24% greater likelihood. And it's kind of amazing how similar the estimates are actually in these two really different cohorts. And all the models adjust for the usual suspects: age, race, gender, marital status, socioeconomic status. Of course, we adjust for depression because otherwise people don't believe the findings. And, so this was really encouraging and sort of got us thinking about all kinds of questions in terms of what are the pathways and, what other factors might matter. And we always adjust for depression. So then we started asking the question, well, if we did this work looking at optimism. There's also been work looking at other forms of psychological well-being, sense of purpose, life satisfaction. So we started wondering if, is it equally good to have a sense of purpose and a sense of optimism? Is more better? And we were actually able to take a look at this question of whether having more assets, because we know that like having more stressful and forms of distress is often cumulative and worse for health. So we kind of wanted to ask the question, kind of flip the question, and go the other way. So here we were able to do this using data from the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, which is a nationally representative cohort from the UK. We had about 4,000 adults who were age 50 or older at the start of the study, and they measured 4 facets of psychological well-being using this measure called the CASP-19, which assesses 4 forms of psychological functioning: control, autonomy, satisfaction, and pleasure. And then we were able to look at, sort of gave even the most protection. So having 3 or 4 facets of psychological well-being versus none resulted in a 41% lower risk of developing disease, which is kind of extraordinary. And these are, even after adjusting for sociodemographics, health status, health behaviors, and depression. So it does suggest that, it isn't the case there's only one path to success in a sense, but to the extent that you're able to have multiple facets of well-being, that's potentially even more protective. So just to kind of summarize quickly, I usually talk about mechanisms. There's behavioral pathways and processes, there's biological pathways, there's social. But in the interest of being able to talk about some other aspects of this work, I'm not going to spend time on that today. I just put this paper up though, because if you're interested in reading more about some of the pathways, this is a compilation of the work that is out now on heart disease. And this was a scientific statement that actually the American Heart Association commissioned that I was involved with. And what's exciting about it is that it feels like they're beginning to, come on board with the idea that, psychological factors matter. And not only that distress and, poor psychological functioning, but also that positive factors matter, as you can see from this quote. So, overall, we're that effective even when you take account of some of the, distress and other negative factors. So these are, again, data from the Nurses' Health Study, 72,000 women. And we looked at whether the women who were most highly integrated socially were at the greatest likelihood of living longer. And that's what we found, about a 41% greater likelihood of achieving exceptional longevity here, which we defined as living to 85 years or older. And then another factor we've been really interested in, which I'll spend a little bit more time on, is prosocial behavior. So this idea that giving to others may benefit the giver as much as or more than the receiver. So here we looked at whether people who engage in prosocial behavior in the form of either volunteering or donating or both would experience lower levels of pain in later adulthood over the follow-up. We had about 35,000 people we were looking at in the UK Household Longitudinal Study, which is nationally representative, 10 years of follow-up. And what the picture just shows you is that folks who engaged in either type of prosocial behavior had lower likelihood of experiencing pain over the follow-up. And those who did more prosocial behavior had an even more reduced risk. And the rate of increase in pain over age, which is sort of fairly typical, was slower among those folks who engage in these behaviors. So, it's encouraging that these kinds of factors are protective. And then the question is, what what will we do with this information? So there's always this question of, can we reverse effects if things are bad? And I mean, Shakespeare says it much better than I do. Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, rease out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote, cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart. I mean, it's hard to say it better than Shakespeare, but the really boring way to say it is, can health effects be altered if we modify psychological and social factors, right? So if we treat distress, we enhance optimism, can we improve physical health down the road? So these are hard questions to answer, again, because the study designs are sort of difficult to implement ethically. We've tried to take a look at it with some of the data we have. So we looked at this question of, if distress remits or goes away, do you see a sort of a follow-on lowering of risk for the physical health outcomes? So we tried to look at this using the data we had on post-traumatic stress disorder. This is back in the Nurses' Health Study with this 54,000 women I mentioned have had the measure of PTSD. And we looked at women who had PTSD and the risk of developing disease, which I showed you earlier. But then we also looked at, among the women who reported a remission of PTSD or a resolution of PTSD, what did their risk of developing coronary heart disease look like? And what you can see is that the women who had severe PTSD had elevated risk, about a 220% increased risk of developing heart disease over the follow-up period, which has been replicated in many different cohorts now. The exciting thing was that for the women who remitted, it looked like their risk was, quite a bit reduced, so that it almost was as if they, did not have the risk, from having PTSD earlier. So that's really encouraging in terms of saying that maybe it is possible to, I don't know if reverse is the right word, but to mitigate the risk effects of being highly distressed, or to boost the protective effects of having higher positive psychological well-being. And then the question is, all right, well, can we modify these factors and do something about them? So we know that, optimism and depression and a lot of these factors are, partially heritable, so about 25%, which suggests that there's some room to maneuver in terms of changing them as well. So, there's a whole range of interventions that we have for improving psychological functioning. These can range from very, labor-intensive or clinically oriented interventions like medication, patient programs, and counseling. There's also, people have developed these writing exercises, which are sort of lower burden. We've talked about pro-social activities, which I'll come back to. So encouraging people to engage in pro-social behaviors, and there's mindfulness and meditation programs. So this is, one set of programs. These are more at the individual level, right, where we could try to improve psychosocial functioning. And of course, interventions will have all kinds of benefits, improving mental health, which is important in its own right, but also maybe improving for physical health down the road. There's an open question of how much you actually have to change psychological functioning to then improve subsequent physical health. Nobody's really ascertained that at the moment. I also like to think a little bit about interventions that are at the population or community level, because in public health, we are thinking about populations and trying to shift the distribution of things. And while individual level interventions are great, they're high burden often and slower. But there are some interesting ideas about community and population-based interventions, school-based, church-based. There's workplace resilience training programs that we can think about. Arts involvement is becoming lots of interesting work happening in that space, as well as on exposure to nature. So these are some other ideas that people have been exploring. And I just want to hone in on two of these for my last couple of minutes. Remember, I talked about the findings we had with pro-social behaviors, which we were really excited about. We were so compelled by some of the work on pro-sociality that we wrote this commentary where we basically said, pro-sociality is underappreciated and in public health as a tool for improving the health of the population. So it can be considered both an individual level intervention, also community level interventions that could be done. And in my view, it's sort of a, a really exciting lever, because not only does it benefit the person who engages in the pro-social acts, but it has benefits for the people who receive those pro-social acts. And if enough people engage in these pro-social behaviors, then the community benefits as well. And probably the easiest way to think about this was in the context of COVID. It turned out that people who are higher in pro-sociality were more likely to get vaccinated, were more likely to wear masks, which meant that their community, so they themselves stayed healthier, but also their communities were healthier. So it's a really interesting lever we could think about pulling that has not had a lot of attention, but there has been some really interesting work suggesting that this is a promising pathway. So this is a study that I wish I could take credit for, but I was not involved in, but I have deep admiration for, which was the Experience Corps. They randomized older adults who were 60 years and older to help school children or not. In the control arm, they didn't. But in the intervention arm, they were helping school children with reading, literacy, math, behavior support. And they did this for over 15 hours a week for 2 full school years. So not a small intervention. And then they had a range of outcomes that they were looking at. They looked at physical function in the, comparing those who volunteered and those who didn't, cognitive function, psychosocial well-being. And, the results, which I've summarized here in 2 lines, but there's many papers on this, were really encouraging and exciting, which is that, for a lot of folks, they were better able to walk, it reduced levels of disability, overall activity was increased. There were also significant improvements in cognitive function, including memory, whole brain volume, hippocampal volume. In the next slide just shows you this a little bit more. For the findings for brain function seem to be a little bit stronger in men. So men in the treatment arm, meaning those who volunteered in this program, had 0.7 to 1.6% increase in brain volume, which sort of translated to forestalling age-related declines in annual rates of atrophy in the brain, which they calculated would look like a 3-year reversal in brain aging, which is really kind of astonishing. So, people are still working on this. We'll see how well it replicates. So far, the findings are pretty encouraging. They're now doing follow-up studies of this group to see if the short-term benefits correspond to longer-term benefits in relation to, likelihood of developing dementia and disability. So the hypothesis is that the folks who engage in these programs will be less likely to develop dementia and Alzheimer's disease, will maintain better functional independence for longer, and higher quality of life. So this is an ongoing study now to do the long-term follow-up. But I think this work is just incredibly exciting. There's also work looking at whether, remember I said there's another kind of more population-oriented intervention, which is nature-based interventions. So we've got some studies where we've looked at whether exposure to nature is associated with better health and functioning. And a lot of the work has really focused on better mental health, but there's definitely increasing work suggesting that nature-based activities and exposure is also going to be beneficial for physical health. And given everything I've talked about here, if nature-based activities are improving mental health, there's likely to be follow-on effects for physical health as well. So this is just a systematic review that came out relatively recently that found that over 50 studies, nature-based interventions were effective for reducing depressive mood, anxiety, negative affect, and improving positive affect. And that the most effective interventions were 8 to 12 weeks in duration, so not trivial, but neither, incredibly burdensome. And the optimal dose ranged anywhere from 20 to 90 minutes. And again, if, improving mental health is important in its own right, but based on everything we've been finding, it looks like it will also have important effects for later physical health as well. So I'm just going to summarize really quickly because I'm just about at time, or maybe a tiny bit over time. So this is where we are with the work so far. Both positive and negative aspects of psychosocial functioning matter for healthy aging, and they are not the absence of one is not the same as the presence of the other. So, looking at one aspect of functioning is not necessarily going to tell you about the other aspect. Like you need, so if you just look at depression, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about optimism. So it's going to be important to look at both and to also understand that the pathways may be, some pathways may be similar in terms of linkages to health and some may be very different. And that's why it's going to be important to not make assumptions that, if you've looked at one, you know everything you need to know about the other. It looks like, and again, I didn't have time to speak to this as much today, but that there are social, psychological, behavioral, and biological mechanisms that are all at play. So what we think of as both direct effects on changes in biology. So distress seems to be associated with higher levels of inflammation or immune function, whereas optimism has been associated with actually healthier lipid profiles, for example, as well as greater likelihood of engaging in healthy behaviors. So there's lots of mechanisms that people are examining and trying to get into. And then overall, what we hope is that this will enable us to build a science of healthy aging, to get a better understanding of both the deficits and the assets and resources that are going to enable people to stay healthy for longer, or, if you can mitigate some of the problems and deficits, that will, postpone the onset of disease. And we'll develop new targets for prevention and intervention. As I said in that first slide, when I showed you that the American Heart Association still has not fully endorsed stress as a risk factor, it's hard to, develop strategic activities to change these factors if people haven't yet signed on to them as being risk factors or protective factors and willing to allocate, precious resources, right? So we have been really involved in trying to make the case that these really matter and we should allocate our resources to these factors. And then again, I didn't have time to talk too much to this, but it's always important to consider the relationships in the context of social and physical environment. I should say that most of the associations we've seen have played out in diverse populations and in different cross-national studies, but there's a lot more work to be done there as well. So still to be examined. And I think with that, I just end with this one last slide, which is to say, if you're interested in hearing more about this work, particularly on the side of the positive factors and assets, Andrew Steptoe, who is a wonderful colleague of mine, who's at University College London and has done a lot of the work in this space. He's actually the principal investigator of the English longitudinal study of aging, which I showed some work on. He and I co-teach this course on emotional well-being and physical health. It's like a crash course in a lot of what I've shared with you today, with the focus on positive psychological well-being. And we get a lot deeper into mechanisms and pathways and methods, some of the methods that are important for looking at this literature. So if you're interested, please check out the website and apply. And then I'll just end with some gratitude, which is good for my health as well, but to say thank you to all the people who make this possible. There are so many amazing collaborators on this work. I definitely couldn't do it without them. Also, the study participants, you see all the different data sets we've been privileged to use and all the people who give their time for that, which is really amazing. And then all the funders who have made this work possible as well. And with that, I think I'm gonna end and I can take questions. Let's see, stop sharing. Yeah.
Wow, that was great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. So I think Josh is gonna allow people to unmute and speak if people have questions for Laura.
Crystal, there are a few in the chat. I don't know if you want to look at those first or. Hi, Laura.
Hey, Sandy.
Yeah, I was just trying to look at that right now.
You want me to read one of them?
Let's see.
Or you got it. Yeah,
I can. Wait, I don't care.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay. How is loneliness measured in NHANES?
Oh, well, the measure that we used was this one item measure from the CESD, which is, limited. which a lot of people have used that measure mostly because it's what's available. Of course, there are other better measures, the UCLA loneliness scale and all kinds of other measures that have begun to make their way into these larger cohorts now that loneliness has been, kind of called out as a potentially important risk factor. So it's not a great measure. It's a single item. I will say though that, when we've had the multi-item measures, it's very, they're pretty correlated with that single item. And kind of amazingly, that single item still predicts. I'm often amazed at the strength of the predictive power, even of the single item. So, whatever psychometric concerns you might have about it, it has the findings are replicated with better measures as well. So, but in that particular study, it's not great. What I don't know, because I haven't gone back to the NHANES study in a little while, it is possible that in more recent years, they have added a better measure of loneliness as the topic has, become more discussed. So I wouldn't rule out the fact that there might be better measures. There's a better measure of loneliness in the health and retirement study as well. So definitely more cohorts have them now.
Okay. In the optimism studies, do you ever examine the role of or adjust for positive emotional experience?
Oh, that's an interesting question. We don't do it as routinely as adjusting for negative emotional experience, because that's the one that everybody's the most worried about. But we have actually done that where we have, I'm trying to remember which studies we have that in. It's harder to do often because you're less likely to have those measures in there. But I think, like in health and retirement study, we have those data. I think we did that actually in some work in the Whitehall study. And usually the findings will hold even when so it isn't that, it's one or the other. They each explain a piece of it. When I've looked at optimism and positive emotional experiences together, I would say more often the independent effect holds with optimism, and the effects of positive emotion, which you might see when you don't have optimism in the model, are less likely to hold, but they do seem to generally carry their own effects, which was why we were interested in this question of, is more better, right? Because if each carries some effect, then, it may be that being high on joy and on optimism is even more protective than one or the other.
Okay, great. How about this one? With regard to age-related psychological factors, has the impact of wisdom on physical health been considered?
I love that question because as someone who's aging, I like to think wisdom is coming along with it.
That was from Yates too, so not unexpected.
So I don't know of any studies that have looked at it in an epidemiologic way, almost certainly because it's not in any of the cohorts. It's almost never. I don't know of any cohorts where it is measured. We have measured curiosity and taken a look at that relatively recently, and that has some very exciting findings. But to my knowledge, like I can't even tell you what a psychometrically valid measure of wisdom is how little I've seen it. But these cohorts are adding measures all the time, so it's an interesting idea to kind of think about, and one could propose it for sure. And like the health and retirement study is really open to thinking about new measures, but of course you have to make the case for it and everything. So I guess the question would be, what is different about wisdom from the other things that we're already measuring, and could it provide additional insight, would be my question if we were having a sort of back and forth about this. I think it's a really interesting idea. And I guess that's the other thing, is what we have found is, not every positive thing predicts better health, and not every negative thing predicts worse health. There are factors that seem to matter more than others. So I think that's going to be an interesting question going forward too, as we have more data.
That's a very interesting idea, because there are some good measures, and there's like a couple competing schools of what wisdom is in terms of this cognitive piece versus a self-transcendence thing. So yeah,
Right.
Very cool. Kim Gantz, you've been patiently waiting. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry. I actually put my question in the chat because I wasn't sure if you get to with me or not. But so I was wondering if most of the studies that have looked at the positive benefits of social interactions, have they mostly looked at like in-person interactions, like the study where they were working with school children, or had they looked at like Zoom or FaceTime or phone interactions? And do those also have positive effects? And has anyone looked at whether in-person is better than these
Yeah,
virtual interactions?
that is such a great question. My short answer is going to be I don't think anyone's done it again in relation to these long-term health outcomes, mostly because the data haven't been available. And in fact, I was really surprised when I went to do that study on social integration, because I was like, oh yeah, social support, we know that's protective. Of course, there's going to be a million studies on it. And there's actually not a million studies on it. And in fact, the measures are really quite limited. The original study that was done on this was 1979, was with Lisa Berkman, and used this what they called this now I'm blanking on the name of the measure, but anyway, they used this like measure that was like, how much time do you spend in kind of groups and activities, and do you go to religious services, and are you close to some number of people and so forth. And it was really mostly about in-person activities, because at the time that's kind of what the options were. And they didn't really ask about phone interactions or anything like that. And then because that measure was predictive and was so surprising to so many people, that's the measure that lots of people include on their studies. And so it's probably only very recent studies where they're starting to even ask the kinds of questions you're asking, like, what kinds of interactions are you having? And is it just as good if I talk on the phone to someone as if I am in person with someone, or if I have a text exchange with someone and so forth? So I would bet that one can start to look at that with some of these studies of youth, where they're now starting to really actively ask questions about use of social media and these kinds of engagements. But I don't know of any studies yet that have linked that, specifically to health. My expectation is going to be that the more meaningful the interaction, the more protective it will be. So in person, is probably still going to have the most, and this is based partly also on looking at some of the findings with social media and physical and mental health, where there is more data. But that superficial interactions, maybe good, but not as good. I mean, there's some really interesting studies on what they call weak social ties, which can be still quite beneficial, but that's still looking at more in-person, meaning like I don't interact with people very often, but people in the neighborhood know my name and stuff. So that's such a great question. I feel like we should put it up in lights and say, please, we all need to look at this. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Can you speak to the dynamic reciprocal feedback loop nature of how emotional and physical health correspond with each other over time, rather than moving in just one direction? Is anyone studying these complex dynamics?
People have tried, and increasingly there's more data to do it. And they're for sure they are bidirectional. In part, we've tried to separate them out because we wanted to say, well, if you're going to target, something for intervention, what are you going to target? And you have to decide sort of at what point do you do the intervention. So we've done work sort of looking at how early in the life course, if you measure emotional functioning, do you see effects on downstream physical health? If you know that, like, say kids are generally physically healthy and you measure emotional functioning, can you predict out their physical health over time, which we have found, suggesting that emotional health certainly precedes and predicts physical health. But there's no question that they're are intertwined, and at some point intervening on either is probably beneficial. So there's a few studies that I've seen where they've looked at like depression in relation to, let's say, I think it was diabetes. Well, it was one study, and then also say physical, maybe it was obesity actually, where they looked at the effect of body weight on depression and depression on body weight, and sort of how that played out over time. And they do find these bidirectional associations Although I don't know how precise, I mean, it would probably depend on the research question. What do you want to know from that, right? And I guess one question is, can you intervene at some point on either to improve the other? And then do you get, sort of knock-on effects that essentially, in like a upward spiral, let's say. And I don't know that people have looked at that. I think what people have looked at is sort of, do they go in both directions? And over what period of time. But that's still limited. Again, like you have to have a lot of repeated data. We're probably going to be in a place to do that in the relative near term. We do have more of these cohort studies and we're finally starting to add more of the psychosocial variables. But I can tell you often you're really limited, like you have optimism was measured once and like never again. So you can't look at the bidirectionality there. So I think that's hopefully, again, part of the reason to make the case for why these things matter is so that we also continue to measure and monitor, and then we can do a better job understanding them.
So fascinating. There's a couple more questions in the chat, but I think we've got like a minute left. So someone wanted to know about nature-based interventions. Are you aware of any really specific natural features that are most effective in relating to positive health outcomes?
People are trying to chase this down. There's sort of a whole big debate about like, yeah, what is it about the nature? Is it green space? Is it blue space? I can tell you that, the findings have been stronger in terms of green space rather than blue like water space. But I also am cautious on that because the blue space data has not been as good. So I'm not as convinced that, the findings are definitive. But then there's this question about what is it about green space? There's a little bit of work that says it's more about the trees than about grass. But of course, then it's also this question of, is it a safe space? So you could have a park that doesn't feel safe for people and it's not clear that, just having green there is better, right? So as with everything, as you get into it, it gets more complicated. There's a colleague of mine who's doing some super interesting work on trying to understand if it's trees, what it is about the trees, and has this idea that trees give off this chemical called terpenes, and that if you're, and through the olfactory system, if you're, inhaling terpenes, that's actually the part that is health beneficial, and has done a really fascinating study trying to isolate where they put people out by trees, and then they either breathe in the terpenes or they filter out the terpenes, and they look at whether that's beneficial for mental health, which is the piece they were able to look at. So I think there's some really interesting questions about it. People have asked the same question about, well, what about brown space, right? Like if you're out in the Southwest and there's not as much green, but there's still nature, right? And mountains and awe-inspiring scenery. So I think the jury is, definitely still out on it. And I would say at this point, I think there's a lot, probably as with findings we have with the emotions and other facets of psychological well-being, there's not going to be just one path to success. Like there's not going to be only one way that nature is beneficial. I suspect there's going to be lots of forms, and it may also be culturally, variable as well.
Okay, there's actually still more questions, but I think Melanie wanted us to do a hard stop at 1:35, which it is a little bit after that, so we probably should cut it off here. But thank you so much, Laura. That was really awesome. We really had a lot. It covered a lot of ground. It was really wonderful. Pulled it all together. So good for you. Wonderful.
Well, thank you. It's been really wonderful to have the chance to share this, and I'm happy to discuss with more people offline if that's of interest. And thank you for listening. Thanks.